first of all, just want to welcome you all to our webinar on grief, loss, identity and weight management. It's lovely to see so many of you here, so I'm really looking forward to delivering this webinar for you today. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start. As it's a webinar, you shouldn't be able to see anyone else other than myself and Ella. So don't worry that if you've got the camera on or that we can hear you, that's not the case, so don't worry about that. Whilst we can't hear you and we can't see you, we'd love to interact with you as much as possible. So please feel free to use the chat function. It'd be great if you want to interact with one another. And as well, we've got the Q&A function as well. So if you want to use that and ask any questions at any point throughout the webinar today, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So any questions, we will answer them at the end. Also, if you're unable to attend the full session, we are recording this session as well. So we will post this onto our YouTube once it's been edited and things like that. And you can come and revisit the session. We will be offering reflective exercises, and it's a bit of a taster within the session. So if you don't feel like you've had enough time within the session, when the recording is put onto YouTube, please feel free to pause that at any point as well and just spend some time going through those reflective exercises if you wish to do so. Obviously, I've put down there as well that if you do feel like you want to write any of the reflective exercises down or use that just to doodle, you're more than welcome to do so. So you may want to get a pen and paper, but if you just want to do it in your head, then that's absolutely fine. So I will start off. So tonight, we welcome you to our webinar on grief, loss, identity and weight management. And we acknowledge that this topic for some people can feel a little bit morbid and a little bit daunting to talk about these topics, and that it's often a taboo subject. But we hope that today we'll work towards breaking that stigma and offer a space to explore your own experiences with grief, loss and identity, and also how this impacts on the context of weight management as well. So we really welcome you to the session today. So I'm just going to move on to some introductions. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. My name's Gemma Cataloa. I'm one of the psychological therapists here at ABL Health, and I work with clients in the North and North East Lincolnshire Tier 3 weight management service. Work with clients around weight management concerns, emotional eating and things like that. So I'm just going to pass you over to Ella, who's going to introduce herself as well.
Hi everyone, so I'm Ella and I'm also a psychological therapist here at ABL, but I work in the Oldham service with the same client group as Gemma, but just within Oldham.
Thanks, Ella. So before we start, I will go through a bit of a disclaimer. So whilst myself and Ella are both therapists, and we'll be discussing a topic that's often brought into the therapy room, this session should not be treated as a replacement for therapy, but instead a reflective reflective session really, and an educational space. So if you do feel like you are in need of any therapy at all, we would recommend speaking to your GP about this, or reaching out, if you're part of the ABL service, reaching out to one of the coaches to point you in the direction for some support. We will, as I say, we'll be offering some reflective exercises. These are all optional, as we appreciate some of these topics can be quite difficult to talk about, to explore. So just go easy on yourself, and you're in no way obliged to complete these exercises, but we're just simply offering them as you may find them quite useful. But it's important that you check in with yourself before completing these exercises and just see whether it feels safe and suitable for you to do so. And of course, self-care, it's really important that you remember self-care. So like I said, it is quite a tough topic and a triggering topic for some people. So it is important that you do engage in some self-care, either within the session or after the session. So it might be that you want to ground yourself, maybe have a warm drink, go for a walk, talk with family and friends about what we've discussed today, and look for any other support. And we will be offering some support services at the end of the session that you can reach out to if you do feel like you've been affected by any of the things that we will be speaking about today. So I'm just going to pass you over to Ella, who's going to speak you through the aims for today.
Thank you, Gemma. So today, obviously, as it's already been described, we'll be talking about grief and loss. And within that, we are going to explore some definitions of what exactly we mean by grief and loss. We're going to offer some theory and reflective exercises so you can explore your own personal relationship with grief and loss. And again, do that at your own kind of discretion, only kind of reflect as much as you feel comfortable with. If you want to just treat this as educational, then that's absolutely fine. We'll also offer some supportive strategies, and we'll also highlight where grief and loss is relevant in the context of weight management. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we'll start with, what do we mean by loss? Here are some classifications. So we've got kind of developmental loss, and that can be, just a natural process of aging. As we get older, we're able to do very different things at different times in life, and sometimes those transitions can be somewhat difficult for us. Then you've got the more kind of traumatic losses that could be through the death of a person or something that happens to you personally, like you become disabled or you get a life-changing injury, or any kind of loss of senses. And then we've also got psychological loss. So that can be kind of loss of self-esteem, trust in other people, confidence, or your identity. Or there could be economic loss, which refers to things like maybe you've lost a job, lost a house, or unfulfillment losses, which is those kind of things we might take for granted. We might have a path that we feel we're going to take, and that might be to get married, have children, but then you don't meet a partner, or you're unable to have children. That would refer to that kind of loss.
So I'm now going to talk about some definitions of grief. So as you can see on the slide, there's quite a variety of different definitions of grief. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there isn't one set definition for grief. So the Collins Dictionary says that grief is a feeling of extreme sadness, whereas Freud talks about grief as a reaction to the loss of a loved person, to the loss of some abstraction, such as one's country, liberty, ideal, or so on. Then Pappas says that grief can occur from any loss experience at all. So that doesn't tend to have to be through the loss of a person. And then Bowlby, some of you might be familiar with Bowlby. He developed a theory of attachment, that the belief that people were born with this intrinsic need for emotional attachment. So this promoted emotional stability and security to ensure survival. And without these attachments, it would result in separation anxiety. So that separation anxiety has been likened to grief as well. Warden suggests that expressions of grief go beyond emotion, often producing irritable physical sensations, cognitions, and altered behaviour patterns. And Schutten-Strobe defined grief as a healthy, natural, emotional reaction containing a myriad of psychological and physical expressions which vary across time and culture. So as you can see there is a variety of definitions of grief, and some mentioning the loss of a loved one, others mentioning non-death losses, as well as how grief can not only be an emotional response, but also something that's manifested as, you know, something that's physical, cognitive, and psychological as well. And a lot of these definitions go beyond the idea that grief is just experienced through death, but we can acknowledge that these experiences can be through attachment, liberty, or another loss experience. So I think what I wanted to get across within this slide is that it's important to acknowledge that grief can be so different for each different individual. So it's important just to check in with yourself what you perceive as grief.
So we're going to move on now to why grief is so important in weight management. So as Gemma sort of just described there, we can grieve for so many different reasons, and one of those can be a physical change to our body, whether that's an ability that we have or whether that is the shape and size of our body. That can lead to a sense of loss because we're different to what we were before. In addition to this, changes to weight can also be really common following the loss of a person because of the really difficult emotions that we experience, whether a traumatic event or stress has been attached to that. That can also have an impact on our weight as well. And grief is often characterized by waves. So therefore, there can almost be a fluctuation in when we might be grieving. We might be fine one day and the next day it feels like you're completely consumed by it. And we're not always necessarily aware that it's grief that's actually raising its head in those situations. So I wanted to just share with you a bit of a snippet. It is from a TV show, but I feel it sort of portrays what we're trying to get across, that it's not always obvious that, that's grief that I'm feeling. So in this particular segment, a lady has given birth to 3 triplets, but only 2 of the babies survive. Several months have passed, and she's kind of been, as you would, having to get on with being a mother, not really been present in her grief. And then she's in a supermarket and she's got a plan for a recipe involving a lemon, but somebody else takes the last lemon, and she loses it at this person that's taken the lemon, and she's, you know, sort of shouting at them and saying, you don't understand, I need to leave that supermarket with this lemon. It's really important to me. I've got plans for that lemon. And on the surface, it might appear, why is she losing her mind over this lemon? But really what that's relating to is the fact that she felt she should have left the hospital with 3 babies and she left with 2. So it's, I suppose, just to kind of encourage that deeper looking into ourselves. What is this behaviour or this emotion telling me? Is it what it appears on the surface? Because grief isn't always kind of really obvious for us to spot. And then finally, it's just to sort of highlight that a lot of people do report changes in their eating habits following a loss, and that is completely normal. There is nothing wrong with that, but having that deeper self-awareness just helps you to understand what's happening for you on your journey with grief. So kind of moving on from that, we've got looking at how time relates to grief. So time is really not linear in grief. If you look at the diagram on the slide, they are actually the stages of grief. And whilst there is merit in those stages, there's no denying that. they are not sort of linear, that we pass through them in that sequence, which is what is kind of we're led to believe, should we say. And actually it's more that you'll go back, you'll go forth. You might have a stage where you feel maybe you're not grieving for a while, but then it'll come back again. And that is completely normal. That doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong, that there's anything wrong with that. But society sort of puts this expectation that grief is something you've got to do and you've got to get through it. And I suppose we're here today to tell you that that's not the case. You know, you very much, you're going to learn to live with it, but it's not something that you can necessarily expect to go away. So that sort of ties into my next point, which is that just because a loss was a really long time ago, it doesn't mean that you're not still in some emotional pain at some times now. And as we sort of previously referred to, grief does come in waves, and no one is immune to this, which is why it's so important that we do kind of open up this subject to talk to, because the likelihood is that every single one of us either has or will be affected by this, and by talking about it, it just becomes that bit more normal and comfortable.
So what does grief and loss mean to you? So as we've noted before, grief can be individual to each different person. So I'd like to invite you now, if it feels safe and comfortable for you to do so, to spend some time reflecting on what grief or loss means to you. So it might be that you want to write this down if you've got a piece of paper and a pen in front of you, or you might just want to sit and reflect. Maybe close your eyes and think about it. But take this time, if it does feel comfortable, just to explore your grief and your loss. And I'll just spend a minute on this, just so that you've got some time to think about it. So what's coming up for you? Maybe it's something, you know, a grief or a loss that you've carried around for a long time. Or it could be something that you've just stumbled across, you know, after I've asked you to sit and reflect on this. We can be so busy day to day thinking about just general life and, you know, keep carrying on. But, you know, until we ask this question, we might not understand what grief and loss means to ourselves. I am going to move on to the next slide. But if you do want to carry on thinking about that, that's absolutely fine. So this next slide, so some of you, you know, you might have found that activity there to sit and reflect quite easy. Some people might have found that a little bit difficult. You may have had something, you know, fresh in your mind that you knew that was what you were thinking about. For other people, they might have found it a little bit difficult because they couldn't think about, you know, the losses that they've experienced, or they're not quite aware of what's been going on for them. And for some people, they often come to me and they'll say, you know, I've never experienced grief or loss, because they've never experienced a death. And what we've spoken about today already is that it doesn't always have to be a death. It could be, you know, something else. So I'd like to, again, invite you to look at this, this figure here, and just take a look at and reflect on whether you have experienced any of these losses. And some of them, you know, you might feel, oh, I didn't think about that. So at the top here, hopefully you can see it. I know it's quite small. Hopefully you can see it okay, but I'll just go through a couple of bits. So there's losses through death. So that could be someone in your family, a mother, a father, you know, a pet, a friend, someone really close to you that was really supportive. Or there's other losses as well. So relationship losses that didn't involve a death. So it could be a divorce, a loss of friendship, you know, the loss of contact with friends or family, or a separation of some sort in a relationship. That is a loss as well, and we can grieve those experiences. And other losses as well, so, you know, loss of a job, loss of control, loss of our physical health or our mental health, loss of a career, loss of life as it was, maybe loss of our own identity, our freedom, our dreams. And then at the bottom as well, there's more losses around historical events. So it could have been some sort of war or conflict, or an act of terrorism, or some other historical event that has resulted in a loss. So you may want to, you know, mentally take note of those losses, or maybe write that down, of those things that you have experienced and those losses that you've experienced over your life. And maybe, you know, you were familiar with these losses, and maybe it's new to you this evening that it's just dawned on you, do you know what, I have experienced a lot of loss, and that's weighing heavily on my shoulders. Again, I'm going to move on to the next slide, but please feel free to just sit with that emotion and that feeling if you do feel like you need to. So I'm now going to move on to disenfranchised grief. And some of you may be aware of what this is, some of you might not be, but I'll just go through what it is and some examples of it as well. So disenfranchised grief is when we experience a loss that's not publicly accepted in society, or acknowledged really in society. So maybe have a think and whether there's ever been a time where you felt that you've experienced a loss or grief, but you felt that no one else around you has understood. And this is disenfranchised grief. So the loss may be, you know, your job, your physical health, your identity, the loss of a pet. And whilst other people in your circle may not feel that they would be affected by those losses, it could be a really significant loss for you and could trigger a significant grief response for yourself. And I think what's important to note here is that Dopa says that we can often experience a double grief and a double loss, because whilst we, you know, don't think that other people can understand that grief or that loss, then we've got the added stress and that added loss of that support system, and losing that support system because it might not be acknowledged within society. And you might be questioning, well, what has this got to do with weight management, and why am I here, and what's this all about? So it's important to acknowledge that this type of grief in weight management, because as people go through the weight management journey and they start to lose weight, an individual's sense of identity may change, which could trigger a grief response. So it might be, you know, you're starting to lose weight and you're starting to not feel yourself. And whilst you're happy that you're losing weight, it could be that you don't understand your identity anymore and who you are as a person. So as well, that links with disenfranchised grief, because it's not something that is typically accepted within society, that this loss of identity, and then we don't tend to sort of express this loss as it's not publicly acknowledged. So this could then result onto holding on to these feelings, which may be then transferred through anger, frustration, sadness. And that can be really, really frustrating to be sat with these feelings that, no one understands what I'm going through. But this is grief, and this is disenfranchised grief. So next we've got the assumptive world. So the assumptive world is an idea that each individual has a set of assumptions and expectations for how the world works, and through our own experiences in life. So what does my world look like, and how do I fit into it? And we're born with this set of assumptions of how the world should work, and how everything, how I fit into it. But when these set of assumptions are threatened, if we experience sort of a loss experience, it could be, that you've lost a family member, or that you're now starting to question the world and your assumptions, because, this family member was a big part of your life, and that's the world as you know it. So once we experience that loss, our world becomes threatened. Or alternatively, it could be that you've held a specific role in society. You've been a mother, a father, maybe a type of job, maybe a nurse or a teacher, and you've got these set of assumptions about yourself. However, when those things change, say if you retire, or your children decide to move on, they grow up, we then start to question ourselves, well, who am I? Because my identity was being a mother, being a nurse, being a teacher. And that can then trigger a grief response. So we then begin to experience these losses, and we begin to question how we fit into the world. And again, you might be thinking, what has this got to do with weight management? But again, we see a lot of individuals that come into our service, and when I ask clients, what would you like to get from therapy? What's your goals in therapy? And most commonly, people will say to me, I just don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what my identity is. And they begin to question who they are. And it could be as well that, with weight management, weight was never been an issue for them, never struggled with losing weight at all. However, something new could crop up, and our assumptions around the world may change. So that could be through ill health, disability, and we might begin to gain weight, which then threatens our assumptions around the world. I never used to have an issue with losing weight, and now I do, and our assumptions then change. And as well, due to the losses, as Ella's already mentioned, we then may turn to emotional eating, and Ella will speak more on this later as well. So I think what's really important to acknowledge is that a lot of the time we'll try and get back to our old self, and it's not necessarily about getting back to our old self. It's around relearning our new assumptions around the world, and that we're constantly evolving, we're constantly changing, and it's important to try and learn as we go along. So I'm now going to speak more about sort of identity, but before we do so, I just again want to invite you to another reflective exercise. So I want to offer this time for you to think about your own identity and who you are. And for some people, that feels like a really daunting task, and a really broad task as well. But it might be useful to think about this in little chunks. breaking this down into manageable parts. So you might think about what you enjoy, what your roles are in your life. So just going to spend 1 minute thinking around what your identity is. Again, you might want to write this down or just sit and close your eyes and have a think about this. We'll just spend 1 minute thinking about this, okay? And I can see some people sharing in the chat, and thank you so much for, you know, sharing that vulnerability and your experiences. Thank you for doing that. Don't feel like you have to, but thank you so much for sharing that with us today. So some of the things that you may have thought about is the different parts of yourself. So your blueprint, your identity blueprint. So it could be your family identity, you know, are you a mother, are you a sister, or your professional identity, maybe your physical attributes, are you tall, are you small, your religious beliefs, your political affiliations, your personality, your race, ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation. These are all parts of our identity, and we're not defined by, you know, one thing. So there's some of the things that you might have thought about. As well as our individual identity, we've also got our social identity. So Tajfel came up with the social identity theory, which looked at a person's identity in parts of in the groups that they form themselves with. So by forming ourselves into groups, this creates a sense of belonging in the world. It also creates an us and them society, and an in-group and an out-group. So this theory is split into three parts, sorry. So the first part is social categorization. So this is where, and we do this automatically, and you might not notice it, but we do this automatically, where we categorize ourselves and the people around us into different groups, depending on the social environment. So it could be, you know, a religious group that they're part of that's part of a group, or a music interest. You know, someone might be into rap music, someone might be into pop music, and we fit ourselves into those groups. As well, it could be a football team, but it's also important to acknowledge that we're not just part of one group. We can be part of many groups in society. And then you've got the social identification. So this is where we adopt the identity of the group that we have identified to. So you might start to speak in a certain way, or you could, you know, dress in a certain way. And one thing that I always think is a really good example is thinking about your football team. So it could be that you start wearing your football team's t-shirt, and that you start engaging in football chants, and that becomes part of your identity. And then we've got the social categorization, which is where we compare ourselves to others that are part of our group, that are not part of our group, sorry. So this creates an us and them dynamic. So some people that we identify with, and other people that we don't identify with as well. So again, what has this got to do with grief, loss, and weight management? So As individuals, we may categorize ourselves into groups. For example, being a person that's found it easy to lose weight, or a person that has found it difficult to lose weight as well. And when people come into our service, we hear stories that they've, I've never had issues losing weight before, but due to a shift in my identity, this has impacted on my ability to lose weight. So maybe becoming a parent, or a change in a job role, or a deterioration of a person's health or their disability. And this can impact on a person's own identity, but as well as their social identity as well. So those people who have struggled to lose weight all their life may begin to lose weight. And whilst they may be happy with the results, their identity can begin to become challenged. So say if you were never able to shop in a certain clothes shop, and now you can, and that might feel strange, having to shift to that new identity, and figuring that out as well. And this will often trigger grief and loss responses as well. So grieving our old self. So like I said earlier, we'll often hear phrases such as, I want to go back to my old self. I don't recognize myself anymore. And the focus often that people will come into therapy about will be around, I just want to get back to my old self. And I think it's maybe not around getting back to our old self. It could be, relearning the identity of the new you. What can you do now, or what can't you do now, and just exploring that as well. But that can impact on our grief and our loss experiences as well. So you might be thinking, what can I do? What can I do? How do I understand myself? How do I understand my identity? So I'd want to offer this activity here. So it's the Who Am I Now activity. So if it feels comfortable for you to do so, I want you to think about a time before that you've experienced a loss, and maybe think about, write down 4 answers to the question, who was I before? And this could be this is based on how you viewed yourself at that point. So again, just check in with yourself before doing this activity, who you were before, and just figuring that out, whether you want to do this activity, if that feels safe for you to do so. Your response could be positive, or it could be negative. It could include a personality characteristic, your beliefs, your values, things that you did, roles that you held, relationships and people that you knew. So for example, it could be, I was someone who was passionate, optimistic, organized, or someone that worried a lot. Or it could be a role, I was a nurse, brother, mother before this event. So that's the first step. So now if you could move on to, if we move on to the next step. So now think about this next question. Who was I when this loss first began? And again, write down 4 answers to the question. So again, this can be positive or negative responses. It can include personality characteristics, beliefs, values, things you did, roles you held, relationships with people you knew. So who were you when this loss first began? I am going to move on just because of time, but again, this is going to be recorded, so if you do want to go back to this and reflect on this exercise, you're more than welcome to do so. So now the third step is to write down 4 answers to the question, who am I now after this loss? So this can be positive or negative. It can be personality characteristics, beliefs, values, things you did, roles you held, relationships with people that you knew. And take some time to think about how your loss has affected your answers and your sense of identity. How has what you've been through affected who you are, what you value, and also things that are most meaningful to you? And now finally, write down, who do you want to be? So try and consider the person that you would like to be in the future. So again, this can include characteristics, values, or roles that you've already listed before, or some that you might want to, you want to work towards. So this is just one activity that you could do to think about your identity and acknowledge the loss that you've experienced. Because I think sometimes with losses, people think, you should just get on with it, but you might not want to. So this acknowledges the losses, but also recognizes where you want to be in the future. So I'm now going to pass over to Ella. And again, if you do want to revisit these slides, they are being recorded. So you might want to revisit them at a later point, but I'll just pass you over to Ella now.
Thank you, Gemma. So what we wanted to touch on was emotional and comfort eating, because again, that's something that we do see a lot of in the service, and is a really, really common coping mechanism for a lot of the emotions that can be associated with grief and loss. So why might we feel drawn to emotionally eat? So kind of understanding the science a bit behind it. So our body produces serotonin, which is commonly known as the happy hormone, and this can act as a quick fix to hard emotions, and it will temporarily lift the mood. So we often tend to crave the food that's higher in fat and sugar, because during times of stress, we are so drained of energy that our body's like, right, I need something that's going to help me function. So that is why we'll be drawn to that food, and the fact that, it does taste nice. The serotonin also lessens the effect of cortisol, which is known as the stress hormone. So whenever you become stressed, you get flooded with cortisol. And that's obviously not a pleasant feeling, as I'm sure we can all relate. And by having that serotonin boost, that does deplete in the body. And it also plays a role in kind of regulating the energy levels that will then kind of impact on our appetite. So we might feel hungrier, basically. So food can also, in the context of grief and loss, serve as a link to a certain time in our life that, as Gemma's sort of gone through, we're not just talking about loss of a person, we're talking about, it could be aging, it could be certain times in our lives that we associate with being happier than we are now, or it could well be, loss of a person and we associate sitting down and eating that food with that person. So if that food reminds you of what you're grieving for, then sometimes tasting that food can feel like soothing, and it will sort of temporarily soothe that for you. And another point that's important to mention within that, as children, it's not uncommon for us to kind of be placated with food. And so, you know, that kind of stereotypical child falls over, we get them an ice cream to cheer them up. But then what can sometimes happen is that becomes a learned behaviour, and we do that for ourselves as adults. So as we've sort of discussed, grief and loss can manifest in so many different ways for different people, but some sort of emotions that are common and described by a lot of people are sadness, anger, despair, or increased stress. And so for this reason, it does actually make complete sense that a coping response would be emotional eating, and there's nothing bad or shameful about that. It's our body's way of helping us through that time. So what can we do about it? So this is another reflective exercise, and again, as has been mentioned, feel free to come back to this and spend more time on it. It will be on YouTube. So the first thing would be thinking about what else brings you comfort or soothes those emotions. And this isn't always an easy question to answer, and sometimes sitting with that for a while can be helpful. Thinking about things from when we were younger. What have I stopped doing that I used to enjoy, that used to bring me comfort, used to make me feel better? Is it a person? Is it an activity? Is it a certain TV show? And then asking yourself, how do I look after myself emotionally when I'm not feeling good? Whether we're sort of identifying that specifically to loss and grief or on kind of a broader spectrum, what kind of thing do you do for yourself if you're not feeling good? And then the final question would be, what brings me happiness and an enjoyment? Again, are they people? Are they activities? And making a note of these things and just giving yourself some time to focus on these can be a really, really valuable tool in kind of broadening your toolkit for how to look after yourself. So now, obviously, that's a very fast whistle-stop tour through that. But how often do you feel that you find the time to allow yourself to engage in these things? Because so often, you know, when people come to therapy, this is something that we will work on and we'll do that activity. And they'll say, but I haven't got the time to do that anymore. But it's sort of about understanding that even if life is busy, it's not selfish, and it's actually essential that you take the time to top yourself up and do the things that you enjoy. Because as I think a few people have mentioned, as I've kind of been talking through emotional eating, whilst in the short term we might get that relief, it can then lead to feelings of guilt, shame, regret, and we then become stuck in a cycle of that negative emotion. And I just want to say that it's not to say that food shouldn't or can't be used for those emotions, but it's about reducing the reliance on food so that it's not our only go-to. So now we've just got some coping strategies, and these are things that you won't do kind of during this session, but they're suggestions that if there's anything that kind of resonates with you of what we say in this section, that you could go away, make a note of it and try it. And these are ways that it's what we call grief work. So it's looking at your grief, giving your grief the time that it needs. And again, that doesn't have to be about a person. It can be about you. It can be about identity. It can be about a time in life. So the first one is a memory box, and that would be being as creative as you want, really, to fill that with things that relate to either that time in your life. Could be clothes, could be pictures, could be perfume. And it's a safe box that you can visit to connect with what you've lost and kind of have that memory. Another thing could be taking a look at old photographs, and you could even make yourself kind of a dedicated photograph book to that, so that if they are maybe photos that if you're not in the right headspace, they might trigger you, particularly, for example, if it's, you know, when I look at pictures of me when I was younger and smaller, I just get upset. Well, don't throw them out, because that's a part of you. Put them in a separate photo album, and that's something that you can then visit when you feel you want to. And in addition to that, if you're more of kind of, you know, prefer writing, you could write down your memories of that time or that person and have a memory book box that way. And then we've got reflective journaling. So that is very flexible, and it could look however kind of feels most comfortable for you. Some of the exercises that we've been through in today's webinar could be examples of kind of getting the ball rolling with that and where to start. Because meaning making has been shown to be really sort of helpful when it comes to processing grief and coming to terms with loss. If you can understand, what does my world look like today? Where have I come from? What got me to today? That can be really powerful in finding, you know, a way forward and not feeling stuck in that grief. So here we've got the dual process model. So sorry, I'm aware I'm talking very fast, but I'm conscious of time and wanting to answer your questions. So yeah, if I do sound like I'm rushing through, it's just for, yeah, making sure we can answer your questions. So this is something that if you popped this into Google, you could absolutely get more information on it. I will talk through it anyway, but it's just, yeah, to give you, if you put that into Google, you could find it. So this is about kind of I say ideal, there's no right way to grieve, but there's kind of research to show that if we can go between grief work, acknowledging that grief, soothing it, but also finding ways to have a breather from it, that is kind of the strongest place to be. Because if we're always in the grief or we're always avoiding grief, then neither are particularly great for us in the longer term. So it's about finding a balance, finding your time to give your grief the time that it needs, but also finding the time to have a breather from it, let yourself come up for air, do activities that make you feel good, that are not about that grief. And then we've got the Tompkins model here for grief. And this is one of my personal favourite models of grief, because I think it just depicts it so well. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not something that we go through and it just ends. It's something that we learn to live with, and it may always be a part of us, and that's completely normal. But what can happen, if you look at the very first picture, the grief takes up quite a lot of the plant pot, but then the grief stays the same size as we move through the plant pots. But what has started to happen is the plant is growing around the grief, and that's what you can do. You can hold on to your grief, you can still have it there, and that's healthy and that is normal, but you can still build other aspects of you, your life, your identity around that grief. So what are our take-home messages? So we're aware we've covered a lot of ground in today's webinar, but some of the key messages that we just really hope we've put across is that grief and loss is an extremely personal experience for everybody, and it will show itself in different ways for different people. Our identity will change for everybody over time, and giving ourselves time to connect to who we are can be really helpful. There's no endpoint to grief, and this will too change over time, and you can learn to live with it and grow around it, but not get away from it. Grief and loss are really normal and natural processes, and at some point in life we will all experience them, and probably many times. And our identity is multifaceted, with many different things contributing to who we are, and our weight, our body shape, our job does not define us. And there are many different ways to explore and attend to your loss and grief. We've only covered a few today, but there are many, many more out there. So thank you so much for listening today. Obviously, we do have a bit of time for questions. If you want to pop them in the question and answer box now, myself and Gemma will have a look through and try and answer as many of those as we can. But also we wanted to highlight that obviously, you know, the topics that we've explored, they can be triggering. And so there are some helpful links there, but always a first port of call if you are struggling is obviously your GP, or as Gemma mentioned at the beginning, if you are within our service, feel free to reach out to a coach, and we do have therapeutic support within the service.
Thanks, Ella. So I'm looking through the questions now. We've got 2 on the Q&A. So one person has said, this is a difficult subject, which I feel daily. How can you get help? So Ella, you've just covered that there, that, you know, I would say, if you are within the ABL Health service, definitely reach out to your coach, because we do, like Ella said, we have therapeutic resources there. As well, speaking to your GP is really important as well, making sure that they're aware, and also they will sort of point you into the right direction. If it does feel comfortable for you to do so, as well, speaking to family and friends, and engaging in those activities that we've mentioned today, I think that will be you know, really helpful through your journey. So if you are on a waiting list, as we know that therapy is very much in demand, there's some things that you can start with before going to therapy to help you process your loss and your grief if you feel that you haven't got access to a therapist. There are private options as well. Sometimes clients will ask me about private options. If you feel like that's something that you can go and you can, you know, access, there is a website called the Counselling Directory, which is a private directory of counsellors that you might want to reach out to as well. So there are quite a couple of options as well, and we've got the links on there too. Is there any other questions that are coming through?
I'm just trying to have a look in the in both boxes. So there is one about where's it just gone? About therapy counting towards your journey with ABL. Yes, it will do. And that is something that you could speak to your healthy lifestyle advisor out, and they could point you down the correct channels if you do feel that would be helpful for you.
That's good. And I can also see another question. So someone's found this webinar really interesting, but now more worried that I will panic if and / when I get weight loss surgery, that I wouldn't want to put weight on, and I will go into starvation mode. I think that's really, first of all, really important that you've acknowledged that straight up, and that you're already aware of that. A lot of stuff that we work on in therapy is around awareness. So the fact that you're aware of that is really, really beneficial. And you're already aware that panic is there. I think it'd be useful, again, to reach out to a therapist or talk to friends about it. Make other people aware of that as well. Normalize that behavior that, you know, I'm worried that I will go into starvation mode, and reach out to friends and family, you know, so they're aware of, you know, your triggers and things that could happen there. So hopefully that's sort of answered that question. Any other questions?
So there's one here about emotional eating due to trauma. So I would say, obviously, dependent on where you are kind of in your processing of that trauma, therapy is probably the best place for you to process that and get some assistance with how your emotional eating is playing into your trauma, because there's so many different traumas. It's quite hard for me to give a specific answer, and obviously don't want you to have to kind of divulge the specifics of your trauma. So I would say, if you feel that is something that you're struggling with, then accessing some kind of therapy would be really helpful with that.
And I'm just looking at the time as well, and we've just gone slightly over, so we're going to have to end it there. But hopefully you've found this really useful. Hopefully I can see some people have said it's food for thought. So hopefully this has been good for you. And if you do want to revisit, as we keep on saying, it will be put onto our YouTube channel once it's been edited, and is a really useful resource hopefully for you. So thank you so much for attending, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great to have you all here. And just to answer that final question, because it's very quick, about who your health coach is. If you're in a group, it's whoever leads that group. But if you're not sure, if you give, I don't know what district you're in for ABL, if you give your admin line a call, they'll be able to point you in the right direction. Sorry, I just didn't want to sign off leaving you without that information.
That's fine, Ella. Thank you so much, everyone.